Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for today's History is Lunch program. I am Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. There are rack cards for the book festival, which is finally upon us. It will be this Saturday at the State Capitol grounds. We also had a few, and they may already be gone, but if not, there were a few of the actual programs, the whole schedule printed out over there. They're gone? They're gone. They're gone. There's a lot of great stuff going on. You can find that schedule online. I will note that if you are a regular History is Lunch attendee, you will have seen many of those authors here, and it makes it a little easier for you to choose which ones to go to during the day. Both of our speakers today, Suzanne Mars and Julia Eichelberger, will be on a panel, though, and you should certainly make it to that one. Then at noon on Tuesday of next week, the Manship House Museum will explore cooking techniques from the 19th century at the hands-on program Forgotten Foodways, Butter and Beaten Biscuits. It will be fun. It is free, but they do ask for advance registration, so give them a call. There are flyers for that with the contact information over there by the cookies. And then I hope that you'll be able to join us here next week for History is Lunch, when our speaker will be Brenda Travis. She'll discuss her new book, Mississippi's Exiled Daughter, How My Civil Rights Baptism Under Fire Shaped My Life. Today, we are delighted to have Professor and author Julia Eichelberger with us to talk about Eudora Welty's correspondence in the 1940s with her agent Dermid Russell and hometown friends John Robinson and Frank Lyell. In June of 2005, Eudora Welty scholar Suzanne Mars gave 4 public programs at the Winter Building, examining each week a different story of Ms. Welty's. Those events were such a success that Chrissy Wilson and the Department of Archives and History realized there was a place for an ongoing series exploring different aspects of Mississippi's culture and history. Professor Mars's biography of Welty was published later that summer, and on August 24th, 2005, the first official History is Lunch program took place, featuring Suzanne Mars discussing her book, Eudora Welty, A Life. We would not be here today if not for the strong start that Dr. Mars gave the series, and so it is with great pleasure that I invite her to the stage now to say a few words about Julia Eichelberger.
Thanks to Chris for that lovely introduction. And now I have the privilege of introducing a friend of mine who is also an important colleague. Julia Eichelberger is Professor of English and Director of the Program in Southern Studies at the College of Charleston. Her teaching has included first-year writing, modern American fiction and poetry, African American and Southern literature, and Charleston writers. Her previous publications include Ideology and the Individual in Novels by Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, Saul Bellow, and Eudora Welty, and Tell About Night Flowers, Eudora Welty's Gardening Letters, 1940 to 1949. Her most recent book is Teaching the Works of Eudora Welty, 21st Century Approaches. She and May Miller Claxton are the editors of that volume. Julia is currently researching the unpublished correspondence of Eudora Welty and Frank Lyell, a lifelong friend and native Jacksonian. Based on this body of work, in 2016, Julia received the Phoenix Award for Outstanding Contributions to Welty Studies. We Mississippians might also do well to name Julia our state's Mother of the Year. From 2012 to 2014, her daughter Sarah Hutchinson taught in Greenville as part of the Teach for America program. There she became the district's first ever middle school French teacher and led her students to linguistic and academic success. Sarah also founded a program called Girls Write the World, WRITE, Girls Write the World, which for the past 3 years has sponsored week-long summer programs for 50 young Mississippi women who have written more than 200 works of original poetry. As mother of a Mississippi teacher and as a college professor who has edited a book about teaching Welty, Julia Eichelberger has surely enhanced the quality of education in our state. And as a scholar who has studied the correspondence of Eudora Welty with John Robinson, Dermid Russell, and now Frank Lyell, Julia has enhanced and will enhance our understanding of an underappreciated and vanishing genre that lies, to use the words of James Watson, midway between art and life. In doing this, Julia has allowed and will allow readers to participate in 3 close friendships, to relish the language that conveys those friendships, and to return to Welty's magnificent fiction with heightened understanding and insight. Please welcome Julia Eichelberger.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That's awfully nice. And thank you, Chris, for having me, and everybody for being here. What a thrill to be here in this wonderful new museum. The last time I was in Jackson, this was just being dug. So I'm excited to see this, and really appreciate y'all being here to hear me talk about these wonderful letters. There we go. Here's Welty. This is Welty in 1931 on the left, and Welty in the 1940s. And I'm going to be talking about her letters from the 1940s because those are the ones that I chose to create this book. Welty corresponded with Dermid Russell and John Robinson for many years, but I selected the 1940s to create this book because it was such a prolific decade in Welty's life, and she wrote a lot of wonderful letters during this period. And I sort of closed the book with Welty taking her first transatlantic trip, voyaging across the Atlantic. So there was a kind of narrative I was able to create just out of that decade. And I'm now working on Welty's letters to another dear friend, Frank Lyell. And so today I'm going to say just a little bit about his letters, kind of put them in context with the letters that Welty wrote to these 2 friends. All of you would know the address of this probably without me telling you. This is the Welty house just around the corner on Pinehurst Street, where Welty wrote quite a few of these letters from her desk. She also wrote some of them from New York, from San Francisco, and various other travels. And as many of you already know, Welty was an avid gardener. And this is a picture of her mother, Chestina, and Welty on the right, both doing what they love to do in their yard at Pinehurst Street. And in this next picture, you can see a plan that Mrs. Welty, Chestina Welty, created for the garden because she designed that garden. The family moved there to that house when Welty was in high school, and so Chestina had free rein to design the garden as she wanted. Welty always called it her mother's garden, but she did quite a lot of work in it and participated in introducing plants and flowers to it. And this letter on the right is a letter she wrote to John Robinson during the war, and you see that design in there. She was showing him where she was planting some different bulbs at a certain place in the hedge, which she knew he would know what she was talking about because he was a great lover of plants and did some gardening himself. And that's why this subject comes up so much in letters to John Robinson and to Dermid Russell. Both of these men were lovers of gardening and lovers of nature, and so it was a touchstone that Welty had with each of them, something she would always report on. This is a picture that Welty took from the roof of the house at Pinehurst Street, so you can see what the backyard looked like and how wild it was back there in that time period. It was just woods back there. So it was really kind of a little natural haven that she enjoyed very much. This picture she also took, and I have Mary Alice Welty White to thank for having these pictures and being able to include them in the book. And this is a picture of some of the bulbs that Welty no doubt had planted in the backyard there. So let me tell you quickly about her three friends that she was writing to. She was writing to a lot more people than that, but these three friends that I'm studying, this is Frank Lyell, and the picture on the left shows Lyell and Welty horsing around in the 1930s the way they often did as a kind of homegrown entertainment. Welty was posing for some kind of pseudo-romantic photograph, and she was being some beautiful shawl-draped lady, and Frank Lyell was pretending to serenade her. He has some kind of a little horn there, and it looks like he's wearing gardening gloves. So, they were very silly, and they wrote a lot of letters in the 1930s, which are so fun to read because they were just yucking it up nonstop in these letters. All sorts of puns, all sorts of great cultural references, and you can see how much they enjoyed each other and enjoyed writing to each other. On the right is a picture of Lyell in the 1940s, and Welty took this photo, and he's on the left, and some other friends of hers, including Hubert Creekmore, is the other man in the photo, and Hubert was also from Jackson, also a writer, and his sister, Mitty, married Welty's brother, Walter, so he was a sort of a brother-in-law once removed, as well as a close friend. And then that's Dolly Wells and Hildegard Dolson are the other people, two very wonderful women, dear friends of Welty also. And you see they're having a lot of fun, which people tended to do whenever Welty was around, I think. So this is John Robinson, and he was Welty's love interest in many ways in the 1940s. They knew each other from their school days and began seeing a lot more of each other in the 30s. And in the 1940s, he was drafted, like everybody else pretty much, during the war, and she wrote a lot of letters to him while he was overseas and was often trying to share a little bit of Mississippi with him while he was away. And the next picture is Dermid Russell. He's the man on the left, and he is in his yard in Katona, New York, which is just outside of New York City, and he and his wife Rose are tending their garden. His letters to Welty are quite wonderful also, and he reports on the things he's planting and growing. And so that was something that a common interest that they would often report on. And here's a picture of Welty herself during the 1940s, and she's working on a story. You can see her typewriter. I love her shoes in this picture. And you see the kind of writer that she was, I think in some ways comes across in this because she's surrounded by letters from people she cares about, and she's sort of in this casual, creative space of thinking hard and working on a story that she's written. So Welty became a client of Dermid Russell in the summer of 1940 after he wrote to her and asked her if she would like to have him as literary agent. And he introduced himself as, among other things, he was the son of the Irish poet who went by the initials A.E., and Welty had actually read his poetry in college, and so she thought, well, yes, of course, whoever you are, I want you to be my agent. And it turned out to be a very happy association for both of them. And Welty met Russell in person a few months afterwards because she was up in New York going to a writer's colony and to Yaddo, and she went to see Russell. He had her in his home, and as a thank you present, she wanted to send him a plant, and he suggested he would like a gardenia. And so Welty sent him a gardenia. She mailed it to him, and so several of the letters in this period, they're talking about Welty's stories, which Dermid Russell is trying to place in national magazines, and he's trying to sell her collection of books to a publisher. But they also talk about plants, including the gardenia. So here's a letter that she is writing to him in September 1940. I'm glad the gardenia got there and is under your hand, and it had better bloom. If it gets to be 10 feet high, send me a cutting. Just now, I'm trying to root you something called the Magnolia fuscata, because we might as well try everything. It has the most wonderful, sweet, thimble-sized blooms, like little bananas all over it, and it is the shrub we all grew up with here. We would all go to school every morning with a handful of Magnolia fuscatas, getting all hot and brown rapidly, and the people we liked we would hold out one to and say, here. They were to put in your handkerchief and lie down on your desk with while the teacher was talking, and you could simply go off into another world smelling them. They were so wonderful they had to be smelled through a handkerchief, and then the teacher would be sure to call you by your whole name and say, bring those Magnolia fuscatas to me and get your book open. So in the coming months, they're talking about Russell's efforts to sell the book of stories, because at that time, publishers were not that interested in publishing a story collection. Nowadays, it's very usual for writers to publish that, a collection of stories first. But Welty had all these stories. She said she didn't really want to write a novel. She thought she was better at short stories, and Russell was having trouble selling them. And so he wrote a letter to her in November talking about a possibility with one publisher, Doubleday, who thought they might be interested in a book of stories that were about the Natchez Trace. And so he said, why don't you write them a letter and tell them what you might do? And also, the gardenia is now, I've put it in the kitchen. I'm hoping that it'll do better. Maybe the smell of cooking will help it. That's what he said in the letter. Very cute. So here's Welty responding to that letter. And this gives you a sense of the kind of letter writer she was, which I find just very delightful as she moves from one subject to the next. Such fine news has me terribly excited, and I hope I wrote the proper letter. If Doubleday doesn't want it, I still think I will do it, and then maybe you can sell it to somebody else. There's no use trying to sell something that wouldn't be good enough not to be written no matter what. That's such a bad sentence that I will stop. Good luck, and let me hear. It is just like spring here, and all the bulbs in the garden are up 12 inches. My gardenia is stubborn too. I don't see why all food wouldn't interchange all right, because the other night in a movie, a lady was sitting next to a man who was coughing, and she took a little box out of her purse and said, have a cough drop, and he ate one and stopped coughing. When she got home, she found her cough drop package intact, and the one that was opened contained vitamin B1 tablets for plants. Of course, he was a stranger, and she never heard whether he died, bloomed somewhere, or what. But one thing is sure, he never coughed a single time after, any more than a plant in a pot. Her doctor was very learned about it and said it would all be perfectly all right. In the meanwhile, I'm going out to take a look at the Natchez Trace, and good luck up there. Yours, Eudora. So you can see what a delightful letter writer she is. I just can't get enough of these letters, and I agree with Suzanne, this is a sort of disappearing art, but it's wonderful to have these letters preserved where we can really see Welty's mind at work and get a sense of her vibrant, just fun-loving and loving personality. So Russell was having trouble convincing these major publishers to take these stories because some of them seemed a little unusual to them. And the things that were most unusual about them are the things that we as scholars and lovers of literature value most highly today. These were modernist stories that had a really fresh and innovative take on life in Mississippi and just being a human being. There's fantastic stories, but not everybody could see that at first. And Welty and Russell talked about that a lot. And she was also continuing to write new stories. He encouraged her. He was very wonderful mentor and encourager to her. But when she talked about the stories, often she talked about flowers in the same sentence, as you saw in that letter I just showed you, and the two subjects seemed often to cross and to really, she was talking about the same thing at one time. Here's a pretty clear example of that when she writes to him in January, I feel that I've let you down. Both in my story and in the little gardenia, which will not bloom. I asked the old man that runs the greenhouse here what to do about gardenias, and he said, wait. I knew that, but it was supposed to bloom in winter. It may yet. So this is a very tantalizing passage to me, and there's so many like that in the letters that I've put in this book, where Welty is talking about plants growing, particularly plants that she is tending, and often she is concerned with her own art, with stories that she is creating that are just coming into being and blooming the way that plants do. And Welty understood with her own gardening that you can't make a plant do something. You can help it, you can encourage it, but you really don't know what exactly it's going to do. And Welty saw her art in similar terms, and so it's wonderful to watch that happening through these letters. But like I said, not everybody was quite ready for Welty's fiction, for the beauty and the brilliance of it. And I have this passage, I quote this in my book, about another gardener. And this gardener is a woman who had recently lost her husband, and she was grieving and spending a lot of her time working in the garden. In that sense, she's not like Welty. But in some ways, I see her as this person as kind of a stand-in for the artist. So I'll read you this passage from the story, A Curtain of Green. It might seem that the extreme fertility of her garden formed at once a preoccupation and a challenge to Mrs. Larkin. Only by ceaseless activity could she cope with the rich blackness of this soil. To a certain extent, she seemed not to seek for order, but to allow an overflowing, as if she consciously ventured forever a little farther, a little deeper into her life in the garden. She planted every kind of flower she could find or order from a catalog, planted thickly and hastily, without stopping to think, without any regard for the ideas that her neighbors might elect in their club as to what constituted an appropriate vista or an effect of restfulness or even harmony of color. Just to what end Mrs. Larkin worked so strenuously in her garden, her neighbors could not see. So, that's sort of a way I like to think of Welty in this time period, working away on these beautiful, incredible stories, even though not everyone was able to see where it was going, and she herself wasn't quite sure where it was going. So here is a beautiful letter that she wrote in August of that year to Russell, talking about what it was like to be out in her garden. And this was in a period where she was beginning to write more stories, and she was feeling this sense of creative expression coming on. And I think you can see it in this quotation. Part of this quotation you can find in the garden of the Welty house. We have had terribly hot days, sensational sunsets, and beautiful nights. Every evening when the sun is going down and it is cool enough to water the garden, and it is all quiet except for the locusts and great waves of sound, and I stand still in one place for a long time, putting water on the plants, I feel something new. That is all I can say, as if my will went out of me, as if I had a stubbornness and it was melting. I feel without ceasing every change in the garden itself, the changes of the light as the atmosphere grows darker, and the springing up of a wind, and the rhythm of the locusts, and the colors of certain flowers that become very moving. They all seem to be part of some happiness or unhappiness, an unhappiness that something is lost or left unknown or undone perhaps, and no longer simple in their own beautiful but outward way, and the identity of the garden itself is lost. It is a little like the sense of deep unknown feelings that used to come to me when I was a child, as they must come to all children at the same time of day, just before dark, when we would all fall back in the grass and look up and wait for the first star to come out. I suppose there's a great deal of feeling in the world now, and some of it is in my garden. So Welty was talking about her garden, and of course referring to the world events that were happening. The world was at war. The United States had not yet entered the war. Here, from that same summer, let me show you a couple more pictures. This is a drawing that Welty sent to Russell in July of that year while she was again in New York at a writer's colony. And this was such a cool drawing that we decided to use it for the cover. And she drew this because she wanted to ask Russell what kind of flower it was, because he was an expert in wildflowers. He told her it was a Canada lily. And then on the right, you can see Frank Lyell with another writer, Catherine Ann Porter, who wrote the preface to Welty's first collection. So lots of cool things were happening to Welty. She was really breaking through in the public, in the literary world at this point. But the war was on in Europe, and people were pretty sure it was going to come to the United States. And of course, sure enough, in December it did. And this is a letter that Welty wrote to Dermid Russell just after Pearl Harbor. He had written to her saying books are slowing a little, book sales were good when the book first came out. They're slowing a little bit. And Welty says, I gather the war may be having a depressing or stagnating effect on the business, but maybe that is just the first shock, and things will begin to go on again. People get used to terrible things quickly. The more terrible the thing, the more quickly they get used to it, it seems. It is part of the kind of ignobility that can put one in despair. Though what hurts now is to see people come alive at cruelty, to give their attention at last. and give it to that, to be aware at last and aware of that, and to be eager to inflict their own. They show off and preen their anger and horror when they have never in their lives given any hint or sign or indication of a feeling of their own, an elation that might have been greater. I suppose it is a small thing to be concerned about at such times, but sometimes I'm in despair about people, and it feels good to hate them as a kind, and to give all your love to a few, and to flowers and animals. I cannot feel a wish for destruction of anyone, but oh Lord, how I want to protect the rest, to keep a few separate and apart. I don't know what I will write next, but I wish it could be something that could make an individual and tender life, when seen alone, seem sacred and inviolate from all beastliness and violence that besets it. People must be taken one by one in the world. That is the way they are loved, believed, or understood. And when we are told to think in masses, we are lost, for the one thing that is the essence and holy is gone. So Welty had a lot of wonderful thoughts that flowed into these letters, and she also sometimes would even dream about flowers and tell Russell about that. And so I'll show you one example. There's several in the book. This is April 1942. At the end of this letter, she says, "I will close with a dream. It was about an iris. The flower floated for the whole dream in front of me, in slight motion and a little larger than life, so that all the pattern of it was shown closely. Then going off from it, stamped or printed on the air, were fainter images of the iris. It set people to paint or to dance or to plan structures and systems or to follow after some romantic thing, all depending on the image thrown off by the iris. And then it suddenly appeared in cross-section and was identical with the floor plan of a great church. This is a crude account, for it was very intricate and very delicately shown. And I had the feeling that it could go on giving off images like a fountain for as long as I could dream it." So that is a pretty cool letter, I think. So meanwhile, the war was going on, and Welty's friend, John Robinson, was drafted. He was trained stateside for the Army Air Force's intelligence, and then was shipped overseas. These pigeonholes that you can see if I can make the pointer work, those are some of his letters. And she drew a picture of this desk at one point and said, "These are your letters, and this is my letter I'm writing to you." So she was writing to him quite a lot. Here is another letter she wrote to him a little bit later, and this is called a V-mail or victory mail letter. It was kind of like an aerogram that people used to write to servicemen in the war. And what would happen is you'd write this on a regular letter, and the military would photograph it, and they would send the microfilm overseas so as to save on the weight. And then they would print it up and give it to the serviceman, and it was really half size from its original. So very small, sometimes requires a magnifying glass for the aging eyes of the researcher to read it all, but there are several of these there. And she'd drawn a little picture of the pear tree in the backyard in this particular letter. She didn't always write V-mails to him. She wrote a lot of regular letters to him, and in one of them she sent him this valentine that she'd made with a bunch of different heart shapes with flowers that she had drawn on them, and that's one of them. She sent Robinson her stories while she was writing them, and sometimes she told him, "I'm writing these for you. I want them to make you happy. I want you to get a feeling of home from these letters." And she was very interested in what he thought of them. When she wrote to him, she often referenced the garden and her own home or natural landscapes, and here's an example. "I sent you some stories one day to look at, but they may have gone to the wrong place," because he was moving around during his training and he was about to be shipped overseas. "It's raining gently, thundering gently, the pine needles coming down like arrows, and it does feel like fall in the air, a little touch of clear cool. It is the kind of air you wish to see in painting when you have felt it in the world, with color implicit around every object, a kind of coming to life of the atmosphere after the fainting away in summer. Over at Belhaven, I hear a piecing together of some Beethoven, with my mind helping and helping at every note. Write when you can and soon. My love to you, E." So there were a lot of these letters to Robinson. In that same summer, he participated in the invasion of Sicily, and she was very worried about him in August. She didn't hear from him for a while. And so this letter was sent after she had finally heard from him. She knew he was okay, and she was writing another letter to sort of share her experiences with him. There is a blue sky, small silver clouds. A thrush is singing by himself. I must go now. When I got your letter, I played the Mozart and some of the other things to think how they would sound in Sicily, with maybe ocean sounds behind them. Don't forget how the Mozart symphony is, ever. I must go. It is so good to hear from you, and it changes everything sometimes when things have happened in the world that make a fresh mystery of how you are. Please take care of yourself. Love, E. So Robinson got through the war fine, and he continued to, he was primarily stationed in Italy, working in the intelligence, and Welty continued to write to him very often. In the summer of 1944, Welty went to New York City, and she was actually hoping by being in New York City, she could somehow get an assignment, a journalistic assignment that would allow her to travel overseas, because overseas travel was restricted during the war. But she was hoping, maybe I can get overseas, maybe I can see John, somehow we can meet over there. Well, that didn't happen, but she did have a great summer in New York, writing reviews for the New York Times Book Review and seeing a lot of plays and enjoying the city. When she got home in October, she wrote a letter sort of updating him. She wrote him all through the summer, all during the D-Day invasion. She talked a lot about the war in those letters. This is the letter that she wrote to him after she had just gotten back to her garden. And in the last passages, she has a beautiful evocation of the garden, and you can see her trying to sort of span the distance between herself and Robinson, almost as if the letters were a kind of portal between the two of them. Somehow through this scene, they would be united. She says, and she's actually writing it in the garden, "I'm working out here, getting all the grass out and watering. The single dahlias are all over the place, those copper-colored ones, and deep red, and little chrysanthemums, butterfly lilies. See if this is sweet or not." She enclosed a few flower petals. "I hope the figs get good up there. I hope the trees aren't mined. John, take care. You have to be all right. That's all I know. But I wish you were here on this day, so hard, smelling the sweet air right here in deep breaths, and your eyes on the camellias doing so well, and hear the water running their roots, the Lyell and the Hermie, the way it is now." So during this same time period, Frank Lyell had been drafted, and he eventually was shipped to London, where he was also working in intelligence but for a different project. And in April of 1945, when Roosevelt died, Lyell sent this letter to Welty talking about how people in London had reacted. "The news of the president's death profoundly shocked everyone over here, and people everywhere still offer Americans their really sincere condolences. They know they have lost their greatest friend, and I love them for it. James Agate, whom I see often at one of the Spirits Until 11 p.m. clubs I belong to, came over the other night to express his sympathies to me and bought me a drink as he continued his eulogy of FDR. I regret that I couldn't attend yesterday's memorial service in St. Paul's, but I heard the broadcast near my office. We had a service here on Monday, and the chaplain put first things first, to my mind, when he said the greatest things about FDR were his making the desires of the underprivileged articulate, and his carrying a vision of the world at peace, which no one else seems to have." So I think Welty very much shared these sentiments, and she wrote some beautiful letters talking about her sorrow at FDR's death and her sense of his personal greatness. She also was anticipating that peace was going to soon be declared. That was the hope. And she wrote this letter to Robinson in May of 1945, and you can see that flowers are still a very important part of their communication. She says, "Yesterday when I was writing to you in the park, a vast jimson weed in the grass was so shining and tall and green and blowing there in the wind, dancing. It looked beautiful to me, and tears came in my eyes. And last night I dreamed it was on your hill where you could see it. I didn't dream you did, just hope still. Only many, it was repeated all along the hill, blowing and bending freely, the same beautiful thing, again and again." So she continued to have flowers as sort of as an emblem of hope, of friendship, of love, of possibility. And so these letters are just wonderful poems, I think, in themselves. Here's a letter from Frank. A lot of their humor that I was talking about in the 1930s letters, you can still see it in in these letters. And this letter, you can see it's from the U.S. Strategic Bomb Survey, which is the work he was doing. They interviewed Germans after the German surrender to find out about the effects of bombing in different parts of Germany. And he addresses it to Dear Miss Zula Kane. I'm not quite sure who that person is, but they used to address each other all the time by fictitious names, sometimes famous people, and sometimes I think like people from Jackson that they were kind of mocking a little bit. And here's a letter, I just wanted to show you a postcard that Welty sent to Frank Lyell in the 1930s that has that same spirit, and it's addressed to Noel Coward, who they admired, and they would address each other as famous people, and she says, Dear Mr. Coward, after seeing your piece in Harper's Bazaar, we're wondering if you would like our Mrs. W.E. Farley. We won her in 1902, and up until now just haven't found any place she would go. So this is the type of letter they would send each other in the 30s. And in the 40s, you can see some of that same sensibility and energy in Frank's letters to Welty. So I just read it, just a few short passages here. One is when he was in line to get a haircut. He says, this is being scribbled while I'm moving up in a friseur queue. I'm next in the chair. If a colonel pacing the floor will just leave, good, he's gone. I'm leaving tomorrow, heading for Hamburg. We'll probably fly to Essen and jeep from there. And he wrote her some very interesting letters from Germany, including this one where he was hearing about some experiences that the French had had. He said, the Russians saved the French from the Germans, but didn't hesitate to take their wedding rings, knives, watches, or anything else the Germans didn't steal. Why do we let the Russians do us like they do? That, to me, is the great mystery of World War II. Inscrutable Russians, indeed. Inscrutable American State Department. It just seems timely, I don't know. He also got to see Beatrice Lillie, the comedian, perform, who Welty and Frank were both just crazy about Beatrice Lillie, and that she came and performed for the troops, so he gave her this report. Wonderful evening. We've just had information, please, with everybody, including Beatrice Lillie, in the garden bandshell behind the Park Hotel. Her accompanist played solos first, then Reginald Gardner imitated wallpaper and trains, then she came on. And he went on for a great deal of more describing the show in a lot of detail. We also, in Welty's post-war letters to Dermid Russell, we can see there's still a lot of her sense of humor and playfulness there. And in this letter she wrote when she had just gotten back from a trip to San Francisco, one of the things she says here is she talks about getting the Italian edition of Wide Net, where she says, I didn't know I could write so beautifully. I opened the book and loved the way it seemed to sound. So admire myself in other languages, she said. But she also was talking about the camellia, and she said, if the camellia doesn't act right this year, burn it. It has gone far enough. So this kind of humor and playfulness was part of all of her letters continuing in the late 40s. That was less true of her letters to Robinson. She and Robinson spent a lot of time together when he first came home, but he was not happy. And Welty knew that something was wrong. She didn't really know what it was. At some point in Robinson's life, and we're not quite sure when that was, he realized that he was homosexual. And that was probably something he was working through in addition to just the post-war experience, a little bit of PTSD that he, like most soldiers, was working through. And Welty was very worried about him, and these letters are very poignant as we realize this relationship, we know in hindsight, this relationship's not going to work out, and Welty is giving it her all, trying to help him and cheer him up. He went on a trip to Oxford for several weeks, and she wrote him this letter from Jackson in May. And you can see again, she's using the garden and nature as this kind of touchstone for the two of them. She writes, how could I be all right in my heart or my mind while not knowing how you felt or doing anything or being anything that would count? It seems a preposterous life to me. Sometimes I feel part of something I don't know all of, or its destination. Sometimes left, no part. It is all right the not knowing, but not the not being. So fresh and moist early this morning. Sometimes the suspense of life rests like a flying bird, not pumping its wings. I felt if we could just ride somewhere, not far, but this morning. So these letters are very touching to read and attest to Welty's love and care for Robinson. She also, I think these letters allowed her to sort of rehearse scenes that she would later write in her fiction, which were very beautiful and had a whole different context in her fiction. Let me show you one more that she wrote to Robinson later that year. By this time, Robinson was trying his hand at writing. And Welty felt, maybe that's going to be the thing that's going to make you happier, and we'll have that in common. And she was very encouraging of his work in many, many letters, most of which actually didn't go in the book because they don't really have to do with flowers. But here's one that has her talking about his story and also talking about a landscape. The most beautiful night sky, full moon and racing clouds, the clouds pure white and long and traveling fast north from the southwest, brilliant dark blue of sky in between, the planets bright and full looking too, in and out. The air fresh, leaves on the trees stirring, flying, shadows and all kinds of agitation, all bright everywhere, makes you look back at it, the world, to come into a house. Those moments when you're without the name of where you are, just on the surface of the world, under that star. I'm hoping you feel fine tonight, have decided about the incidents of the story, and put it from you. Much love. Good night. It was so urgent and beautiful. So even though I find these letters poignant, kind of sad to think that Welty was lavishing all this affection on a man who ultimately could not return her love the way she wanted, these scenes, I feel, got sort of repurposed unconsciously in Welty's fiction. And in her book, The Golden Apples, particularly, there are several scenes where characters are alone, sort of emerging with the landscape and just enjoying the beauty of nature surrounding them. That's often the way a story resolves itself. And so here's one from The Wanderers, which is the last story in The Golden Apples, and she wrote it in 1948. The whole story was published the whole book was published in 49. And the main character here is not thinking about a beloved. She's alone here. For that journey, it was ripe afternoon, and all about her was that light in which the earth seems to come into its own, as if there would be no more days, only this day, when fields glow like deep pools and the expanding trees at their edges seem almost to open, like lilies, golden or dark. She had always loved that time of day, but now, alone, untouched now, she felt like dancing, knowing herself not really in her essence yet hurt, and thus happy. The chorus of crickets was as unprogressing and out of time as the twinkling of a star. So in the 1940s, Welty wrote some tremendous books, many of her best known, and it was just a very, very productive decade. So it's been a great privilege and pleasure for me to get to know her through her letters, the things that she did not write for publication, but as I hope you can see, they're definitely fit for publication. I want to close with two more letters that she wrote to Russell. First one tells you where I got my title for the book, and she's talking about watching a flower open. There has been much hard work in the garden, and it is a hot, steamy, rainy time with beautiful, long-lasting sunsets and soft black nights with wind from the Gulf coming in the south and the cardinals and mockingbirds singing all night again. Every evening between 8 and 9, you can watch the Calypso daylily opening. It is a night daylily, the palest pure yellow, long, slender curved petals, the color of the new moon. To see it actually open, the petals letting go, is wonderful, and its night fragrance comes to you all at once like a breath. What makes it open at night? What does it open to? In the same progression as others close, moment by moment. Tell about night flowers. Yours, Eudora. So I couldn't resist using that as the title because I feel that the book presents the night flowers of Welty's garden and of friendship and also of the creative imagination that opens unconsciously. In this last quotation. I'll just leave this up here in case you get bored during the question and answer period, but I use this for my epigraph because it's a beautiful note that she sent to Russell about what flowers meant to her. But I want to stop now in case there are any questions that people would like to ask, any comments that you have, and Chris, I believe, has a microphone that he can bring to you for any questions that people would like to ask so that they can be picked up on the microphone. But thank you very much for your attention. It's been fun to talk to you today.
I'm not going to believe it. Too many folks here with gardens and wealthy connections.
Yes.
There's my hero.
This is not really about the gardening. It's a question for you or Suzanne. What was she doing on the roof when she took that picture? And the second question is, it appeared to be an ashtray with a cigarette when she was writing the letters. Did she smoke?
Yes, she did smoke. She did smoke. Occasionally mentioned that in letters. Yeah, I was surprised to learn that. What she was doing on the roof, I guess, it seemed like a good place to get a picture. Right, Suzanne? I think that's true. Yeah, it was much more common to smoke. It was a little treat you would give yourself, like having a drink, or having a nice piece of candy. People didn't realize how bad it was for you.
So we have her letters because she made copies of all of them?
No, here's the fascinating thing. She did not reread any of these letters. John Robinson and Dermid Russell and Frank Lyell kept her letters. And so they were eventually, each of those sets of letters was returned to Welty. She outlived each of her friends, and the family returned the letters to her. And so she had this vast collection of letters that she donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and so they're all in the Eudora Welty collection. But it's incredible to me to think of these letters that she just wrote. She licked the envelope, never thought about them again. But I think that the practice of writing them activated some things in her head and sort of contributed to her creative process at the time. She actually, at one point, was considering destroying all her letters because she didn't want anybody to read them. She thought they were private. And some of her friends talked her out of that, fortunately. So that's why we have them. She didn't keep copies. She just sent them off, and she wrote just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters. It's incredible. I don't know how she had time to do anything else, but there we have it. A question over here. Oh,
I was going to ask you, what did Robinson say to her?
Well, there are not as many of Robinson's letters extant, so we don't know as much about what he said to her. Before her friends managed to convince her not to destroy any of her correspondence, she actually destroyed Robinson's letters at some point. She told her friends after the fact. And there are 2 letters from him to her that survive from the 1940s. And I think that was just by accident, really, that those survive. So we don't know what he said to her. What we know, and you can read about this in Suzanne's book, is from many other friends who saw them together and his letters to other people, which survive. We know that he thought very well of her. He really did sort of act like a boyfriend. I mean, he sent her presents. He sent her a lot of letters. On the other hand, he never. There was never an engagement. I don't think Welty was really even expecting that. So we have this one letter from Robinson to her that he wrote while he was in the war, where you get a little flavor of him as a writer. And he was sort of writing an impression of the wartime. So I think that he very much cared about her and wanted to share his impressions, his thoughts about art, his own creativity with her. But we don't know too much more than that from the 1940s correspondence. So I'm very curious. I wish I knew what those letters were like. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, during the 1930s and 40s, there was the Great Depression, and I'm wondering if the Great Depression had any impact or effect on Eudora Welty's writing or gardening in any way.
That's a great question, and I think it did. I think that Mississippi, like the rest of the country, was suffering under the Great Depression, although Mississippi was already poor, so it wasn't the same dramatic difference that it might have been in other states. But Welty was very much affected by the Depression. She herself never wanted for anything, but she worried about money, and she herself worked for the WPA in the 30s, and that's when she took some of her famous photographs that you can find in, there's a book that's called One Time, One Place, Mississippi during the Depression. She carried a camera around with her and took a lot of photographs of people in rural Mississippi, often very poor people, but they're photographs that really pay tribute to the dignity and the resilience of Mississippians. She was also very interested in the life of African Americans in Mississippi, something that a lot of white people did not have a lot of interest in this state. And so she was unusual in that way. I think the suffering and the kind of fleeting nature of the prosperity that you might have enough to eat one day, or you might have a good job for a couple of months and it wouldn't last. I think Welty was very sensitive to that, and as a writer, she had a sort of a lesser version of that of the precariousness of one's position in the world. So I think the Depression had a lot of impact on her. She also very much appreciated the FDR administration's attempt, a largely successful attempt, to help people make it through those lean years. And she had great admiration for Roosevelt. And so I think all of those things affected her. And the knowledge that these people that had very little still had a very important and vibrant inner life. And she wanted to write stories that would sort of show that. I think that affected her too. Thanks.
There are fans over here for the Eudora Welty House. Don't forget that you can go tour the house and garden and see
go if you haven't gone.
so many of these flowers and plants that you've heard about today. And so we've got hours, information, all that over here. Pick one up to remind yourself of that. Thank you all for coming today. I hope that we see you at the book festival this weekend. I hope that we see you back here next week. But help me thank Julia Eichelberger for this program today.
Thank you.